Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, March 12th, and we have a great show. We're going to get into spring practice. This is going to be the big topic of today's show. It is getting going around all of the country right about now, and definitely want to break that down for you guys. And we might as well jump on in. No time to waste. Let's go ahead and jump into the spring practice preview, and a lot of different things are going to be going on over the next couple of months and really into next year as we get an idea of what the new world of college football looks like. Obviously, a lot of new things changing in terms of the revenue structure, in terms of the player payment. All of those things are going to be changing over the next little bit, and then you're also going to have to keep up with all the teams and how they're looking going into next year, because there's quite a few teams that are staring down a massive spring practice, and we'll get into a couple of those here in a second. But let's go ahead and jump into here, and first let's talk about the storylines that we're going to be looking at as we get into these next couple of months. Revenue sharing is going to be a big time one. We've already seen a couple of different headlines out there of teams just trying to find money wherever they can. I know A&M signed a huge 15-year deal with Playfly Sports that will absolutely help out some of those things that are going to have to become due, because as we all understand by this point, $20.5 million is what every school around the country has to play around with when it comes to revenue sharing from those TV deals. And the question is, how do you break that up by sport, and then how do you break that up within the sport of college football? It's a big kind of a debate right about now. Now, Title IX is something we've talked about in the past, and I've written about a little bit on my blog, but the reality is this is not going to apply. Title IX will not apply to revenue sharing. It is going to be split as the athletic department sees fit. So, as you can imagine, a lot of that will be going to the college football programs all around the country. A lot of that number will be going to the quarterback one and maybe even the edge rusher one, depending on what team you're talking about. So, there's a lot of different things that are going to be happening over the next little bit with this. I know there's different hearings happening over there in Washington, D.C. right now. Obviously, that will take a little bit longer term than I think a lot of us would hope, but hopefully there will be at least a little bit better of idea how all this is going to work. The reality is we probably won't really know the effects of this, how all this is going to break down, until it unfolds. Until next year, we'll get a better idea of where all the money went, how it was spent, was it spent effectively, do teams need more money, is it creating a more balanced playing field like Kalen DeBoer talked about at Alabama, or is it kind of hurting the sport in another direction, which is a real reality, because NIL is still a big time part of this conversation. So if you have $20.5 million and then a little bit extra to spend, which plenty of teams do, then you can go right back down to the NIL portal and just try to see if you can outbid teams that way. So going to be a really interesting thing to watch, both from a recruiting perspective, how do people approach this from an NIL comparative to the revenue sharing system, and then just how does it work once it's put into place in 2025 is going to be a really fascinating thing to watch. Another thing is going to be the spring game changes. You know, you won't see as many spring games this year as you've seen pretty much every other year before this. Texas, Nebraska, USC, among some others, are not doing spring games at all. Ohio State, Ole Miss, who did this last year, are kind of doing untraditional spring games. So for Ole Miss, that's the Grove Bowl games. We've talked about that a little bit. Really enjoy that idea. I think it makes total sense. I think the reality of spring practice is the reality of all spring in general. You want to make sure the fans are involved in some way or another. So I'm hoping that Texas, Nebraska, USC, they give fans an open practice at the very least, or a signature session, whatever it is. Just give the fans a chance to go into DKR, to go into Memorial Stadium, to go into the Coliseum and be able to see these players, at least in the offseason, because a lot of us are already starving for football, and a lot of those fans want to be involved. Now, we'll still see plenty of spring games, and we'll get into that at the very end. We'll go through kind of the schedule of those spring games, but the reality is we're not going to see some of the bigger ones, and I think that Texas one was going to be very interesting for a lot of people. We'll have to wait a little bit to see Arch Manning in real action. Then you got coaching changes, and that guy is going to dominate a lot of the conversation. Bill Belichick going over to UNC, thought he was going to be on a Hard Knock style show, didn't end up happening. And I think the reality was they probably accepted it, and then Bill Belichick heard about it and said, I am not doing that by any means. I'm not giving you all the access that you very much want if we're going to do this. So that is not going to happen anymore. We won't get that inside look, but we'll get plenty from UNC over the next little bit. I can promise you that. Don't know what that year is going to look like. We'll get into predictions a little bit later on, probably after spring if I'm being honest, but definitely a team that is going to get a lot of headlines. But then you have Scott Frost returning to UCF. You have Rich Rod returning to West Virginia, which very interesting story about TikTok happening around there. But at the end of the day, going to be really interesting to watch those two guys. Dan Mullen's back in the game of college football over there in Las Vegas for UNLV, and tons of coordinator changes all across the country. Two up there in Columbus, Ohio, that they're going to have to replace some very, very talented play callers. So it's going to be interesting to see all this unfold. A lot of different coaches going all over the place, and we'll get some pretty early returns over the next couple of months. And then we got QB battles. And this is something we will get into in the next segment. I will give my pick for all of the big-time QB battles all around the country. The reality is you got Michigan, Alabama, Ohio State, and plenty more that are looking for their next signal caller. A couple of those feel like they have their guy pretty much set in stone, and we'll get into that in the next segment. But there's also a couple that are entirely up in the air. And I think this one right here, Alabama, is going to be huge. You got three different guys, as far as I'm concerned, that are competing for that spot. And you got to have Kalen DeBoer, who needs at least 9-10 wins, probably needs to go to the CFP if he doesn't want Alabama fans breathing down his neck for another 365 days down there in Tuscaloosa. But those are the storylines, the big-time storylines you're going to want to watch. Obviously, there will be a million other things. We'll get into the NFL draft talk. There's pro days going on, so plenty of stuff to talk about. We will get into a lot of that stuff next week and kind of going throughout spring, but let's get in some teams to watch. I only have 3 here. We'll continue to do this on my blog, go through a ton of different teams you're going to want to watch and reasons to watch them, but these 3 really stood out to me for kind of different reasons. But we'll start with the Texas Longhorns, and let's just be totally honest, it's because of that guy right there. Arch Manning is going to be a huge topic of conversation throughout this year. There's no doubt about that. But on top of that, the O-line is replacing 4 starters. You have Matthew Golden, Isaiah Bond, Gunnar Helm walking out the door. Quinn Ewers obviously walking out the door. The 3-year starter is not an easy guy to replace by any means, even if you do have a Manning waiting in the wings. But obviously, we won't quite get the spring game that we want, but there will be plenty of talk. I can promise you that. And it sounds like in that wide receiver room, a couple of guys are down for injury throughout spring. It sounds like Ryan Wingo is the only wide receiver in that room currently that's getting snaps throughout spring at the very least that has a catch in the college football world. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Guys like Aaron Butler is someone that I really like. That's going to be really fascinating. Dalen McCutcheon coming in as a freshman. Khalil Lockett, Jamie French as well. So it's going to be interesting to watch those guys develop. If Texas does dip into the portal for another wide receiver during spring, maybe it didn't go quite as smoothly as they were hoping to for those guys early on in their careers. Michigan's the other one. I think the reality is Michigan was on top of the mountaintop. They fell back down to 7-5, but got that win over Ohio State. And now you move forward in 2025, and it's a start of a new era more than anything else. I think you look at a guy like Bryce Underwood coming in, and we'll talk about him obviously in the next segment, but the reality is with him coming in, you promised him $12 million. Everyone knows that. That is fully on the table. They know what the price tag is. You got to bounce back. And the reality is when you look at that schedule, very navigable. There's not a lot of big-time matchups. Obviously, you have the Ohio State one, but no Penn State, no Oregon on that schedule. They're going to be able to navigate this pretty well. Now, you're losing guys like Will Johnson, Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham, and a ton of guys on the offensive side of the ball, including that running back duo. So there's plenty to replace, but bringing in guys like Justice Haynes, bringing in a couple of transfer wide receivers and a couple of guys on defense, I think they're going to be more than fine, but they got to bounce back in a big way. And the reality is it's probably going to fall on number 18 to Bryce Underwood's shoulders, and if he can't answer the bell in spring, he's probably not answering the bell during fall either. And then Miami, and yes, that is a Georgia jersey there. Carson Beck is their new quarterback. The problem is he is injured right now, so you got to figure out what you're going to do with him going forward and how quickly does he progress, because the earlier he can get throwing to these receivers, the better off that Miami's going to be in that first game against Notre Dame. So they're kicking off with a really, really huge one, and they need this guy ready to roll when he gets there. Sounds like he's changing his number to 11, so something to be on the eye out for. If you see number 11 on the practice field out there, see how he's moving. Just see how quickly he can get the ball out of his hands. As of right now, he's not throwing it all. We'll see how quickly he gets back on pace. But the other part is Emory Williams. You know, you have a guy that has a UCL injury in Carson Beck. You need that backup quarterback to take strides forward. Last year it was relatively ugly in a number of different places when he got on the field. That has to change very, very quickly. If it can't, then he's going to have a big-time problem on his hands. And Miami might just have a big-time problem on their hands because if Carson Beck goes down again next year, do you feel confident about the guy right behind him? So they got to be really careful about this. It's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. We will not see Carson Beck a lot, or really at all, until the summertime, until really fall camp. he better be ready for fall camp, because if he's not ready then Miami's going to look a little bit out of sync in week 1. They're going to fall to 0-1 a little bit faster than they would like to. So going to be an interesting thing to watch. Those 3 teams really stand out to me for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, Texas will get a lot of talk, and we will talk about them plenty. Miami will follow Carson Beck very closely among a lot of the other guys they've brought in, but the reality is those 3 teams need huge springs, and let's look into the schedule and when these teams might be gearing up to play their games. And April 5th is when it all really kind of gets underway. UCF, Clemson, West Virginia all getting underway, so we'll be able to see Scott Frost. We'll be able to see Rich Rod at their old universities, see what they can do back at the helm. And then, obviously, Clemson's going to be a fascinating watch. And one of those teams that I'm watching very closely as we go into the next year. I think the talent level is absolutely elite, a little bit closer to that national level that it was in 2016 and 2018. Will be really interesting to watch what they can do in that spring game. Then Ohio State, Alabama, Florida, Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Auburn, LSU, and Georgia, they're all on April 12th. As we all know, that's kind of the big week when everyone kind of gets it out of the way. A lot of the SEC teams find their way to that weekend, so will be fascinating to watch what Georgia does. We talk about quarterback battles here in a second. I'm not going to include Georgia because I feel fairly confident that it's going to be Gunnar Stockton, but a guy like Ryan Puglisi is someone they really like down there. You have Ryan Montgomery coming in as a freshman. It'll be an interesting watch. There's no doubt about that. Tennessee will be really interesting to see what they're doing. Oklahoma with John Mateer. So April 12th, I will be absolutely glued to my TV trying to watch all these games and see what these guys have in them. And that Notre Dame team, another QB battle we'll talk about here in a second. Then you get to the next week, 18th and the 19th. You have South Carolina on the 18th on that Friday night. And then you got Michigan, Texas A&M, Colorado, and Texas Tech all on that 19th. And it's going to be a really interesting group. I think for Michigan, obviously Bryce Underwood's going to be the story. For A&M, I'd love to see what Marcel Reed has done over the offseason. Needs to take a big step forward passing the football, and we'll see if he can do that in that game. And then you got Colorado. That's always going to be a huge storyline, especially with Caden Salter coming in. Another QB battle that we'll talk about in the next segment. But overall, that's going to be a really fun day. Texas Tech is one of those teams that you just want to watch for a little bit closer this year because a lot of things are going right down there in Lubbock. And then Oregon and Penn State that following weekend on April 26th. 2 great teams, 2 teams that very much want to win a national title. It'll be really interesting to see what Dante Moore has. It'll be fascinating to see if that Jim Knowles defense shows us much of anything on that day. And then Washington finishes out as they always do on May 2nd. Very late, right in the middle of that portal window, so it's always a little bit messy up there in Seattle once they get their spring game underway, but will be really interesting to watch a guy like Damon Williams Jr. go to work because one of my favorite quarterbacks as we head into 2025, one of those guys that you're just not going to want to miss. I can almost promise you that. So that's the reality of spring practice. As of right now, we got a couple of teams to watch. We got plenty of storylines to watch. Got to 4 right there, but plenty others, obviously. And then you got spring games coming all the way down the road throughout April into May. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great to watch all of this. There will be plenty of overreactions to be had. I will do my best to not overreact. The reality is a lot of this is a zero-sum game. You don't know if the offensive line is great or the defensive line is not all that great or vice versa. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. Don't put too much into spring practice, but definitely we'll have plenty to talk about in that. And the biggest thing is going to be the QB battles. And we got to talk about it right after this break. We got to get into Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State, and a ton of other teams that are just trying to find their signal caller. I'll give my pick for who I think they're going to be right after this, so stick with us.